evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on our first cool evening of the season. My name is Dana Little. I'm the Urban Design Director for Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. And I appreciate you all pulling together this evening for a special meeting. We've got a schedule that we're trying to maintain, and this has been very helpful, so we appreciate it as a team greatly. I am the quote-unquote project manager of this from Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council side, but as I said, Jessica Seymour is with us this evening, and she's very intimate with all the details of Palm City and all the mapping and the planning that's gone into this. Let me just see, by a show of hands, how many of you have seen a presentation either about the Palm City code changes or about any of the CRA code changes that we've made to date? Okay, so this is going to be a lot of new information for a lot of folks. So I'll try to keep it from being too boring or too planning detailed, but there are some pieces of this overarching 2-year effort that are already in place, that are already law, that we want to talk about. Last year in August, the Martin County Growth Management Department and the Community Redevelopment Agency, Susan Corris, the Executive Director is here this evening, approached the Regional Planning Council. We are a public agency. We've worked with the county and the CRA on various projects for decades. And they approached us to say, well, you know, we've got the vision of the 6 CRAs that have been in place for 20 years. We've been tinkering with the codes and with the land development regulations and the rules, and we just feel that it's time to maybe really update those, really get into them, scrub them out, and make sure that they make sense. The idea is to update the land development regulations for each of the 6 CRAs, which, starting in order, would be Jensen Beach, Rio, Old Palm City, Hobe Sound, Port Salerno, and then Golden Gate. At the time when we put together our agreement with the county and with the CRA, we were very aggressive. We would start we'd start a new CRA every 3 months. And for the most part, we've been able to stick to that schedule. But it's been a pretty remarkable experience in terms of discovery, how different and unique each of the CRAs are, how unique and consistent some of the challenges with the CRAs are, especially as it comes to regulations. So I'm giving you this little background because almost immediately when we started this work last August, it was apparent to us that we had to get into the comprehensive plan of Martin County and make some recommendations, some revisions to the comprehensive plan as it relates to the CRAs. Now, I've been working in Martin County at the Regional Planning Council long enough to know that, you know, touching the comp plan can be taboo in Martin County. But we knew that that was one of the reasons. Some of the confusion lay between the disconnect between the comprehensive plan language and the daily operating system, which is your land development regulations. Now, I don't expect you to read all this. This is meant to impress you. No, but honestly, we've tried very hard throughout this effort to engage as many people who are interested to be engaged, starting with the NACs, the NAC members, the LPA board members, the CRA board members, which are the chair of each of the NACs. Of course, the county commissioners, we brief them periodically. But as we start each of the CRAs, we conduct usually 15 to 20 individual one-on-one hour interviews with property owners, investors, developers, residents, etc. Not only so we can get input from them, but so that we can try to demystify what it is we're up to on the front end. Because whenever anybody gets a letter that says, we're the government and we're rezoning your property for you and trust us, it's a good thing, you know, there's obvious, you know, reason for curiosity and sometimes even concern. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is go over briefly some of the history of this, where we are in terms of the comprehensive plan and some of the regulations, and then talk very specifically about Old Palm City. This is the schedule. As I mentioned, there are the 6 CRAs: Jensen, Ryle, Old Palm City, Hope Sound, Port Salerno, Golden Gate. We are here now. I know you can't read this, but we're in November. We're actually on time, and I thank Jessica for that. But we've actually adopted the comprehensive plan amendments and Jensen Beach, and I'll talk about that a little bit now. This is our more detailed adoption schedule. If you spent any time reviewing this, you'd realize that this is its own design challenge in and of itself in terms of meeting the deadlines of the NAC, the CRA, the LPA, and the Board of County Commissioners, knowing that some of these plans, some of these changes have to go to the state, some of them stay locally, what the advertising deadlines are. And so Susan and her team, including Jordan and Jan, have done an amazing job keeping us on track. And I kid you not when I say this is its own design challenge. It's very complex. So there are 3 main parts to this. Number 1 is that, and I'm going to reverse the order. Number 1 is that the way that the rules work today, you've got 2 major documents that are controlling growth and development within Martin County. One is the comprehensive plan and the land use, the future land use designations that are applied to the land. And then 2 are the land development regulations. That's the detailed code stuff that tells you your very specific density and height and setbacks and all of that. When the CRAs were created back in 2000, 2002, and there was a very robust public engagement and outreach effort that was afoot to develop the vision of each of the CRAs. When we started this a year ago, our first question was, do we need to revisit the vision? I mean, are people thinking about Old Palm City differently today in terms of building height or densities and all that kind of stuff than they were 20 years ago? And frankly, the answer was no. The visions remain intact. It's just they haven't been implemented. And because they haven't been implemented, it's hard to tell how to debug, some of the issues. So what happened back in 2000 is that in order to create regulations to implement the vision, overlays were created for the comprehensive plan, for the future land use maps, and overlays were created for the zoning. So what that meant is that if I had a future land use category of say commercial, but I was in the mixed use overlay, I could do certain things, but it kind of depended upon what my underlying zoning was and whether or not I was in a zoning overlay district. And if I wasn't, that might change the rules back this way, but if I was, it might, you know what I mean? It's literally like 4-dimensional chess. Our first goal in this, which is what led us to the idea of changing the comp plan, was to get rid of the overlays. The overlays are causing an awful lot of confusion. So the second primary goal was to create new future land use designations with 2 categories. Because keep in mind, we're talking about the CRAs, which are concentrated areas, and within the CRAs, there's what was the mixed use overlay area, the town center component. So we thought, let's simplify this. Let's say we've got a CRA center designation, which everybody identifies what the center is. It's Map Road, it's Martin Highway, etc. And then the CRA neighborhood future land use would be all the lands outside of that, because what you find in most of the CRAs is that there's the little commercial core, there's some corridor stuff, but most of the land is dedicated to single family houses, and the goal was not really to change that at all. And then finally, to rezone each of the CRAs so that we could implement new subzoning districts. I know this is very planning wonky, but the idea was to shed all of the old rules. Do you know that there are 3 different, correct me if I'm wrong, 3 different at least layers of zoning, A, B, and C. Some of the old zoning from the 60s that it's still on the maps, but it isn't utilized and it's defunct. B, which is kind of not as old, but and then the A zoning. So it's a myriad of, it's a tentacle of different regulations and rules that cross-reference one another. So we thought, let's shed that and let's start fresh again. Not with the idea of benefiting developers or taking away property rights. Certainly we would never do that. But to clarify the rules so that everybody knew what was expected of them. So I mentioned back in 2000, this is 2003, the Community Redevelopment Area Plan for Old Palm City was created. This is your vision plan. This is where you all as a community came out together and said, we want to look like this, we don't want to look like that. As I mentioned, two major components to this, the comprehensive plan and then the land development regulations. I remember almost to the day when we were meeting with Nikki Van Vano, the growth management director, and her whole staff. And by the way, this has been a very collaborative effort. Our agency, the CRA, growth management, the engineering department, the legal department's been very key so that we're not taking anything away from anybody. But we said, look, let's just create a new chapter in the comprehensive plan. Rather than reference here and reference there, let's just go for it. We'll create a new chapter in the comprehensive plan. Right now it did end with chapter 17. We'll create chapter 18. It's dedicated to the CRAs. So the majority of the information that you need relative to the comprehensive plan is inside this new chapter. And the new chapter is then implemented by a new Article 12 in the land development regulations. They're parallel documents in the sense that Article 12 is also dedicated to each of the CRAs, and I'm going to explain to you how that works tonight. So in Chapter 18, we create those new future land use designations that I talk about, as well as we remove the mixed use overlay, and we went through and did some other things as well. We know that through development in other cities and in older areas, oftentimes it's harder for the smaller investor to meet some of the development requirements and procedures than it is for a bigger developer. Bigger developers can afford to carve off 18 or 20% of their property for on-site stormwater detention. You know, if I've got a 50 by 100 foot lot, that's a very difficult thing to do. So working with engineering and county staff, we tried to balance some of those rules in favor of the smaller investors. And some of that is also embedded in Chapter 18. I'm happy to say that this was adopted by the Board of County Commissioners at second public hearing on September 10th. We had to send it up to DEO, the Department of Economic Opportunity in Tallahassee. They had 30 days to review it. They had no comments. They got it back to us and we were able to adopt it. And then it became effective last month. And so what that did is it took the existing, or what was the existing future land use map and the overlay areas for map Martin and Martin Downs here, and we created this new future land use map. This is the overlays that we got rid of. And so what you see in red here, I know it's hard to see, is the center. What you see in brown, which is the majority of the land, is the neighborhood future land use. And some of them that didn't change just got brought over. Like, for instance, industrial. We weren't going to change the industrial. Or commercial waterfront, or, commercial general. Some of these other colors that we brought in, some of the recreational ones and preservation, we just lifted those and brought them over. There was no need to change those. So Article 12, as I said, which is the land development regulations, which we're going to speak specifically about this evening, it creates new sub-districts that it now speaks to the future land use categories. And I'm happy to report that the first round of that, which was Jensen Beach, Division 1 and Division 2, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, that was also adopted at second hearing on September 24th by the Board of County Commissioners. So imagine you've got this new set of rules in the comprehensive plan, which is going to enable us to do these new codes for all 6 CRAs. However, even though Jensen Beach is adopted, Rio is not yet, and Old Palm City is not yet adopted. So the old rules have to stay in place. So what's happening is we're kind of leapfrogging, if you will, with each of the CRAs, and by the time we're done with all 6, we can do what's called a repeal and replace and get rid of all the old language. But I'm telling you this because the structure of these guys, this, by the way, is the new zoning map, replacing the overlays, as I said. And then we have what's called a regulating plan, which we'll get into a little bit more detail later. This identifies the sub-districts, the new sub-districts. Now keep in mind, We're sitting there for months with the legal department, the growth management department, and the CRA. And you saw a little bit of this if you're at the last presentation, where we're going lot by lot to make sure that, we're not taking anybody's property rights or we're not giving anybody something that's onerous or, ridiculous. But what we've done is we've created these new sub-districts, which are the core, and then what's called detached here, which is the majority of the single-family areas, corridor, and then this is multifamily in the brown here. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. This is effectively a new zoning map, but it provides more information than just a zoning map. Typically, a zoning map will just have those colors, and that'll be it. But here we also identify where the Ripple project sites are. We identify where there are new pocket parks or where there are goals to have new pocket parks at the end of these streets at the waterfront. We identify the civic site of the building that we're in today where some of the parks are. We're trying to clean up some of the regulations too, so that if there is a park that has a commercial future land use, as an example, we're changing that to ensure that it remains a park. So this is what I was getting at before. See how to make this not too complicated. There are 7 divisions within Article 12. Think of it as a book. And it's got 7 divisions or 7 of its own little chapters. Chapter 1 is general. There are rules and regulations and clarifications and definitions and graphics that apply to all of the CRAs. Okay, so, like what is a building type? Or what is a regulating plan? Or what are the stormwater standards that are consistent for all 6 CRAs? This Division 1 was adopted with Jensen Beach, which was Division 2. Now, I know you can't see this, but this is Division 2, Division 3, Division 4. This is who we're talking about tonight. That's you, Old Palm City. 5, 6, 7. We did this because, as I said before, we've adopted Jensen, but we haven't adopted Rio yet. So we're trying to establish a methodology that we can move and get these changed and get them implemented, but we don't know what will happen in Port Salerno. We have no idea what will happen in Hope Sound. But we wanted to create a framework where any of the CRAs that have a problem with this won't bog down the other CRAs. Not only that, but we know we have to adopt these individually because the rules are going to be tailored for each of the CRAs slightly different. What's acceptable in Jensen may not be acceptable in Old Palm City or in Hobe Sound. What's acceptable in Rio may not be appropriate for Golden Gate. So there are rules that are consistent. There's a methodology that is consistent. But by structuring it this way, through the approval process, we can tailor and tinker and modify each of those CRAs as you all and the community see fit. There are, what did we say, Jess? There's like 148 different permitted uses that apply through all of the CRAs. Now, that doesn't mean that 148 uses are permitted in all CRAs, but there's this big, long list of things, from haberdasheries to funeral parlors and moratoriums. All right, Jess is telling me there's no haberdasheries, but there's a long list of things. And what we decided to do was group them by their impact. If I have a cottage and I'm running a painting studio out of my outbuilding, and I might have weekend gallery visits, that has a different impact than if I'm building a strip center, or if I'm doing some other type of use that has tremendous vehicle turnover, or lots of deliveries, or things like that. So we tried to group retail, commercial, the different institutional uses by their impact, and we created what we call permitted use groups. The permitted use groups live in Division 1 of this document. So in Division 1, you can go to the permitted use group section and see all 148 of them and see how we tried to organize them a way that made it a little more user-friendly on the ground. Because What we were then able to do is in Old Palm City take all of those and get them on a single page. So basically, mobile homes in Old Palm City are not permitted. Accessory dwelling units are permitted throughout Old Palm City in the different sub-districts. These are the sub-districts I talked about. Core, corridor, industrial, multifamily, and detached. You have 5 proposed in Old Palm City. Single-family dwellings are not permitted in the core, but they're certainly permitted in the multifamily and the detached areas. Bed and breakfast inns are certainly permitted in the core and in the corridor, and even in the multifamily and detached areas, but they're not permitted in industrial. So we try to group these in a way that one who is making an investment in town or wants to make modifications or develop their own property can quickly assess what uses are permitted and where. By the way, this is a whole new format. It's all new graphics. But again, with each and every use, we went with the legal department and Krista Story. If you don't know her, she's awesome. And growth management in the CRA to make sure that we were not taking away anybody's permitted uses that exist today. Now, I'll tell you, it was interesting in Jensen Beach. This actually happened. We were being very orthodox about that. Like, if you're permitted to have this use today, you're going to have it tomorrow. And their NAC said, hey, we don't really want any crematoriums in downtown Jensen Beach. You know, is there the likelihood that someone's going to build a crematorium in downtown? And that's kind of the litmus test we have to go through with each of these type of uses. Has anybody talked to Jordan or Susan or anybody in growth management about doing a particular use, even though it hasn't existed maybe for a long time? If so, we have to be careful about removing that use because somebody may have what they call investment-backed expectations to do that. So we've tried to be very, very careful about that. This was no simple or casual exercise, I can assure you. Now, I'm sure that we may have missed something along the way, but what we're doing is we're establishing the architecture of this whole system so that, as I've said 1,000 times before, we're creating an operating system that applies to all of the CRAs. Right now, if you want to do something in Old Palm City and you want to do something in Hobe Sound, I mean, the rules don't align. You know, there are different procedures and different ways to address things. So in order to make investment attractive and not easy and not without regulations, but predictable, to make investment and development predictable, not only for developers, but for you as a community, we believe this system is going to get you closer to where you need to be. Same thing with development standards. Again, I know you can't read this, but on a single page, we have, again, the vertical columns of core, corridor, industrial, multifamily, detached. And this is a quick assessment of like, what are my minimum lot sizes? What is my building height? What is my allowable density? Building coverage requirements. And where can the building types go? We'll talk about that in a little bit. Some of the CRA, actually we'll talk about it now. Some of the CRAs were already regulating by what we call building types. You're allowed to do a townhouse type or a shopfront type or a courtyard type. You know, these are architectural sort of descriptions of building types. Some of the CRAs were not. We thought that because there's such a wide range of conditions, from Jensen all the way to Golden Gate. I mean, some cases where you've got lots that are 18 feet wide. You know, you've got waterfront conditions. You've got upland preserve conditions. You know, you've got large, I mean, along Cove and Salerno Road is very different than along Map Road, you know. So we thought that illustrating a full spectrum of building types so that people can visualize what it is we're talking about and it's not just numeric and narrative, we can assign those to places and give, I think, a level of comfort to the neighborhoods and to the development community, investment community, what they're allowed to do. So I'll just read these quickly. Shop front, mixed-use building, office building, apartment building, courtyard building, townhouse, live work. There's some overlap in these, but But what we do, and you'll see in a minute, we illustrate each one of these and then in this chart identify where they're permitted or where they're not permitted or where they might be permitted under certain conditions. Oh, here's a detail of the development standards. Again, each one of the CRAs gets one of these so that you can quickly assess. Some of this information was in the glitch bill that you all have been through before. Again, very, very careful about adding density or adding height. By the way, I should go back and say there are two third rails, if you will, in development in Martin County, that if you touch them, you die. One is maximum building height of 40 feet, period, right? 4 stories, 40 feet. The second one, of course, is the maximum density allowed in Martin County, period, is 15 units per acre. That doesn't mean everywhere allows 15 units per acre, but the most dense areas of Martin County can only be up to 15 units per acre. We have respected that and are not challenging that at all. However, there are a couple things that we're going to want to talk to you about tonight that are changes unique to Old Palm City. So here we are. This is the existing regulating or the proposed regulating plan. We wanted to show you that in these areas in orange, it is currently 15 units per acre allowed within the mixed use overlay, and it remains that. That's what we're proposing. And as I mentioned earlier, we went through and literally where these boundaries are, because the old boundary split houses in half, it split lots in half. So we had to, number one, always defer back to the existing future land use as the comprehensive plan as direction, but also make some professional judgments. If somebody has 4 lots, they've got a house in the middle of it, they own the 4 properties unified, and they're split in the middle, they're in one district on one side and one district on the other, well, which district do they go into? Because that doesn't make sense. We've tried very hard not to split lots or split parcels with different and sometimes even competing regulations. So we went through that a lot last time when we were here with the NAC, showing you some of the tests that we went through, particularly in this area back here, where we draw the line and where we move the line. But never are we grabbing multiple lots or anything like that to grab it into the center or push it out. We're just trying to rationalize what's on the ground. Now, in the industrial district, there's a change to allow residential in the industrial district that's within the zoning overlays. And the zoning overlays came out to here before. And that would be up to 10 units per acre. That's consistent with what we've seen in other CRAs. We had some debate about that. Some of the rules I think are clear that you can do residential, we think. Some of the rules say you can't. So we're leaning on allowing for or permitting up to 10 units per acre in the industrial district. Now keep in mind, that doesn't mean anybody has to do it, but if I can backtrack real quickly, that goes back to what are the permitted building types too. Because in an industrial district, we're saying, well, a shop front building might make sense, or a live-work building might make sense, or an outbuilding, but certainly not single family or something like that. Also, there are areas of medium density that exist today. We've done a lot of discussion and debate about the medium density areas here just north of Martin Highway. Just east, I can't read that road, I'm sorry. What's that? Yeah. Before, a few years ago, you were permitted to do 4 stories in this area. That has changed, not exactly sure when, but this is considered a medium density area, which today, as of right, permits up to 8 units per acre. However, there are some caveats, some bonuses that are availed to someone who is providing workforce housing, extra landscape buffers, some things like that, that enables them to get to 10 units per acre. Just for this area in orange, we're recommending that it go to 10 units per acre because we don't want to, it's hard to say, well, I was availed of those bonuses before, now you've taken those away from me. You know, so we've debated that back and forth, and in a case like this, we would rather err on the side of somebody getting 2 units per acre rather than the county being legally challenged. Now, the other filter is when you actually go out there and drive around and you look at aerial photographs, there's not a whole lot of room for redevelopment anyway. And you know, there are minimum parcel sizes and things of that nature. So there are some natural limitations to what someone can build on their property. But this is a case, and we wanted to bring it to your attention, where we felt that better to err on the side of an additional 2 units per acre in the medium density areas because that opportunity was available to them already. Now here's an interesting case. We spent a lot of time discussing this. The red here is the core. This is your most intense. This is intended to be your main street, you know, your mixed use or commercial or residential of a higher density. And it stretches a little bit into the neighborhood here. But there's a front to back transition area here. If you know Martin Downs Boulevard on the south side, these houses are looking at the back of commercial properties. It's not an ideal condition. In a perfect world, those would be deeper lots so that you could have some buffering or even a liner type of townhouses or something facing the neighborhood. But that space doesn't exist, and that was gobbled up by the widening of Martin Downs years ago. So one idea is that to allow for townhouse type here, which is a more resilient building type to protect the single family neighborhood, we recommend that this little piece here go to multifamily. Because in the detached area in the brown, the townhouse type isn't allowed. The density is too great. That also would be up to 10 units per acre. Now that's still less than the 15 in the core, but we wanted to point that out. Our first inclination was that this is detached. It's the lower 8, I think, right? 5, I'm sorry. That's right. The other area of challenge was this area west of Map Road. Now you can see the CRA extends to the creek back here, right? And all of these streets dead end, except for this one, and then down here to 34th. Already 2 or 3 lots deep in some cases would be the core. There's single family back in here. There's some redevelopment opportunities back in here. And there's also some commercial businesses back in there. It's an interesting smattering of things. Initially, we thought, well, this should be detached as part of the single family neighborhood. But you know, the more we studied it, the more we looked at it, the more we thought about, well, what's actually happening out there today? And not wanting to curb investment by restricting any future investment in this area has to be a single family house. We thought, well, townhouses might be a good building type back there. So we chose to make this, or recommend that this become a multifamily subdistrict as well. Now here's the kicker. This area then currently has a maximum density of 5 units per acre. Going to the multifamily subdistrict would bump this up to 10 units per acre. Now, I say that, and we're pretty familiar with what's left out there in terms of development opportunities, and it's really intended to allow for a more resilient building type for residential, as there may be future commercial and things like that. So I wanted to point these two cases out to you in particular, because those are, if I'm not mistaken, these may be the first 2 examples where we are intentionally, let me back up. The goal isn't to increase the density, but to, what we believe, do a better planning move for those areas. The allowable density would go up. Wanted to point that out to you. The rest of the density in the detached areas remains the same. You can do 1 unit per lot and an additional outbuilding. That doesn't change. We had no intention of changing that. And here's the other change that we're recommending. And we talked about this a little bit at our last NAC, and I can tell you we've had exhaustive debates internally about this. But I mentioned before, up until recently, I want to say, I don't know, 6, 8 years ago, whatever it might have been, we don't know the date. You were allowed to do 4 stories in the medium density area here. It's like where the apartment buildings are now. I don't think there are any 4-story buildings in there, but it was allowed in the old R4 zoning. But this map just shows you that in the entire CRA, everywhere in the CRA is allowed to be 3 stories except Map Road, which is limited to 2 stories and 28 feet. Now, I believe that that was probably a decision made collectively years ago. I don't imagine it was an oversight, because you all have been actively involved in this in a long time. And in fact, we had a discussion about it at our last NAC meeting when we brought up, this whole effort. But, we're looking at this thinking, okay, well, this is our main street. Everything else is 3 stories. And this is the widest right-of-way. Well, I take that back. I think probably Martin Highway is the wider of the right-of-way. Martin Highway, keep in mind, becomes less concentrated in uses. There's industrial over here. Plus, you don't control both sides of the street. Susan lives over here. And this neighborhood, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have divulged that. Yeah. And then up here, you've got a much more fine-grained but wide right-of-way in Martin Downs. But this has, I think, always really been considered sort of your Main Street opportunity. Couple of things that we've done. We know that, number one, it's a very wide right-of-way. It's 100 feet wide. There was a discussion at the NAC when we were here last time about, well, is 2 stories appropriate? Is 3 stories appropriate? So we did some testing on this. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, because there's a plan that's going to be implemented for this road. Wait till you see it. It looks great. But we wanted to test something before we just shut it down. So if you'll indulge me for 50 seconds, I'm going to give you a little planning lesson. There's something called the spatial relationships of streets, okay? This is actually the Architectural Graphic Standards. This isn't Dana making this up. This is a real book that real architects and planners use. But there's a ratio between the height of a building and the width of the street. Your more intense European cities and villages have a ratio like this, or maybe even more intense, like New York, it's like 10 to 1 or whatever. Typically in a small town scale, a ratio of 1 to 3, a ratio of 1 height increment to 3 increments wide is considered very pleasant. But the wider the ratio gets, or the lower the ratio gets, the more challenging it is to create space. In fact, it's been proven the less desirable the location is. So there truly is, when we talk about creating a public room, it's not just us making it up. So for instance, this is Winter Park. If you've ever been to Winter Park has a really comfortable ratio of 1 height increment to 3 increments wide. And that's a very intimate sort of commercial street. It's certainly not Map Road. This is the opposite of that condition, where I live, unfortunately, in Palm Beach County, where you've got a ratio of 1 to 20. So your building height is 12 feet, and your road right-of-way is 160 feet wide. So you've got no possibility of creating any sort of meaningful experience or spatial relationship between the buildings and the width of the road unless you were to go really big. Now, have any of you been to City Place in West Palm? Okay, so we thought this would be fun. City Place, actually, this is the old Macy's. Macy's is gone, but this is the Dreyfuss School of the Arts back here. When they designed it, it has a 1 to 1.5 ratio. It's a pretty intense ratio. So we thought, well, what would that look like if it was a 1 to 3? Or worse yet, a 1 to 6? So you can see the wider the street gets relative to the height of the buildings, the less pleasant or the less memorable it can be. So we did a couple tests just for discussion this evening and for moving forward. This is Map Road. Map Road has a 100-foot right-of-way, which is common. The question is, what is an appropriate building height, to have that sense of spatial enclosure. Now, if you go with the 1:3 ratio, that means that the buildings over here should be 33.33333 feet in that range, which is approximately a 3-story building. So this is actually going to be beautiful. I can't wait to see this. This is the diagram of what the MAP road improvements will be. Very wide sidewalks here. These are 10 feet at least. Planting areas, on-street parking, bike lanes, single travel lane in each direction, which was a huge move because you could have blown this out to 3 or 4 lanes, which would have made it very difficult for pedestrians and bicyclists to get back and forth. So kudos to that. On-street parking on the other side. By the way, the on-street parking is essential, okay, because it's going to provide that 1-ton metallic buffer between your pedestrians and the moving travel lanes. And that's very, very important for these businesses and these residents and things to thrive. What we've shown here are existing buildings on this side, and then this is a 3-story townhouse here, just to give you a sense of scale. So this is a very, very small snapshot of what's happening on all of Map Road. The conditions will change based upon what the context is. We only did this just to talk about building height, because everywhere else in Palm City is 3 stories except for your Main Street. So we just wanted to, if we're going to have a conversation about this, provide you with some visual tools to try to make that decision and see if there's any comfort level moving forward with that. So, but anyway, at the ground level, I think you can feel excited about what Map Road is going to look like. I know I would be. So again, this is the map, and then for discussion is potentially 3 stories there. We would like to recommend 3 stories on Map Road, and just as a caveat, what we're doing in the other CRAs that are 3 stories and 35 feet, we're recommending they go to 40 feet. That enables more generous floor to ceiling heights. It doesn't enable you to get another floor in there. But depending upon where your elevation is, what your soils are, what your flood, if you're in a, bless you, if you're in a floodplain, etc. That's what was approved in Jensen Beach and what we're recommending for Rio as well. And this is just a detail, as I showed earlier, of all the different building types and where they're aligned, where they're permitted per different districts. The building types, as I mentioned, we've established a single plate, if you will, a page for each of these that shows, what does a side yard house look like, and where can it sit on its lot, and where should its parking go, and what are the setbacks and building height, etc., etc. As well as a description of sort of the function of each of these. So, like I said, there's a shopfront building, office building, courtyard apartments, townhouse types. We've tried to imagine every possible building that could go. In fact, we're still making ones up. We created one for Rio that's unique, that's a boat barn building, which enables you to do a functional boat barn in Rio, but not have a 200-foot blank corrugated metal wall against the street. So the recommendation for the boat barn is that you have a ground floor liner use that could be offices or something else. But it activates the street, which is important in the core area, and it would be limited to the core. We also get into some architectural details in terms of some of the critical dimensions for porches, arcades, shop fronts, etc., so that your staff in the county, not everybody has the same experience, so that everybody's working from the same hymnal, though, if you will, and giving consistent recommendations. My personal pet peeve is when you have an arcade that's only 2.5 feet wide, so you've got to sort of shimmy through it. And it has implications on the street too. So we've provided a detailed plate like this for each of the different frontage types, which include the storefront, the arcade, balconies, and porches. We also took, the county has an existing set of what they call traditional neighborhood design street standards, but they weren't very illustrative, and so working with the county engineer, we redrew these and brought them in so that in the future, if there are other road improvements desired in Old Palm City, Golden Gate. We're having this conversation right now about Golden Gate. You know, are any of these appropriate for some of those conditions? And they're not regulatory in the sense that you shall do this type of road. They're meant to be more informative to help, you know, communities have discussions about the future of some of their key streets. And so that's it. What we're here to do this evening is hopefully give you a comprehensive overview of the efforts to date. We're requesting that this board this evening ideally make a recommendation of approval of what you've seen for the future land use map amendment, which would affect the new Chapter 18 in the comp plan, the land development regulations, that structure as I described with the building types and the use groups and the regulating plan, etc., and then the ability for the county and county staff to rezone to allow for all of this to happen.